Many are now aware of U.S. funding and CIA training of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that later led to the rise of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, which massively backfired against the U.S. Now, publicly available declassified documents show the CIA's hand in developing the Ukrainian nationalists, aka the Nazis in Ukraine. Here with us to dive deeper into what these documents reveal is journalist and historian Lori Spencer. Lori, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kim. Great to be here.
So walk us through what these declassified documents are saying. When did they begin this program?
Well, we didn't, first of all, I should say we didn't even know about this program until the early 2000s. The documents were declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act.
Wow.
As it turns out, the CIA had quite a bit to disclose. These programs began almost immediately after World War II ended. And really, you could trace it back a bit, if we could rewind, to April of 1945, when Winston Churchill basically started what we call the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And Churchill came up with a plan called Operation Unthinkable. The plan was to stab the Soviets in the back after they had just won World War II. Winston Churchill then decided that communism was the greater threat and that the Allies should all band together and use repurposed Nazi soldiers that were prisoners of war to invade the Soviet Union. There was even talk of using nuclear weapons, and there are several programs related to that as well. So they started working with American intelligence, and this is before the CIA was even created. We're talking about the OSS, we're talking about military intelligence. And when the CIA was created in 1947, they took a great interest in these factions inside the USSR in Ukraine that were Nazi war criminals, had collaborated with the Nazis during the war. And that includes Stepan Bandera, that includes Melnik, and Mykola Lebed, and some other nefarious characters. CIA thought they might be useful because the goal was to overthrow the government of the Soviet Union.
So this is making a lot of sense when you think about it, because Ukraine was at that point the USSR. We were entering into that Cold War, so we wanted to do everything that we could. And many of the wars that were waged after World War II, and even as we see now, have been essentially aimed at the USSR, or now Russia, and trying to destabilize them, or, well, really not destabilize as much because they were proxy wars all around the world, but mostly to really drain them of money, I think, was probably one of the big purposes of all, and to stop their expansion, their influence around the world. So it makes sense that they would have this kind of eye on Ukraine, especially if they have these sort of insiders. But how did they, but these people were inside of Ukraine. So do we know from these documents how they were able to get in touch with these particular people, train these particular people inside of the USSR? It's one thing to be outside of the USSR, like West Germany at that point, right? Because you're right on the border of East Germany, near the USSR territory, but not in it. So do we know how they got in and they were able to train inside the USSR?
That's a very good question. And the documents reveal how this worked. You know, these war criminals were wanted by the Soviet Union. They were wanted men. So, you know, towards the end of World War II, when the writing was on the wall that Germany was going to surrender, they skedaddled. And most of them went to West Germany. Stepan Bandera was at a hideout up in the Bavarian Alps. So he made contact with American intelligence and MI6, as did some of his co-conspirators. They were in hiding. They could not return safely to the USSR. And that's when the CIA started coming up with projects such as Aerodynamic, which was one of their, well, not one of their best ideas. The idea was to literally parachute these guys, drop them into the Soviet Union, into
Wow.
Ukraine, and they would train, arm, fund with taxpayer dollars these insurgent guerrillas to do guerrilla warfare. After the war, you could say that the war was still on. Nobody told these guys World War II was over.
Yeah. Yeah, so now we see that from these documents, and these have been out, like you said, for a long time, with this disclosure, this, what was it called? This is, I mean,
It was called the
completely
Nazi War
eye-opening.
Crimes Disclosure Act.
Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Do we
Mhm.
know, were there any, did they try to go after anybody and have them held accountable for these types of things, these types of programs? Or, I mean, why did they need to disclose this if they weren't going to actually do something about it?
That's a good question. Not really sure about that. By the time this was all disclosed, all these guys were dead.
Ah, okay. But their
So there
legacy
was
has
nobody
lived
left to
on.
prosecute.
Right. Okay. But the legacy of what has been going on, really the training. So this does seem a lot like what happened with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in a lot of ways. And that was
Yes.
for the exact same purpose, right? The Mujahideen we funded and trained in an effort to stop the Soviets. It was that they were going to
Hmm.
fight and give the Soviets a real heck of a time.
That's
Which,
right.
Hillary Clinton even famously was laughing about recently, saying, well, this is going to, with the Ukraine war, this is going to play out as well for the Russians as it did against the Mujahideen, which also did not play out very well for the United States or anyone in the West, for that matter, when it comes to the development of these organizations, of these terrorist organizations. So, but now, interestingly, we are not fighting against these Nazis as like we did with the Mujahideen becoming Al Qaeda, right?
Right.
Instead, we're continuing to fund and to arm, and even now, in a lot of ways, revere them. I mean, we saw with what was going on in southern Ukraine with the takeover there of the Azov battalion, and
Hmm.
of the steel plant, and then they were revered as heroes. And
Right.
these are the definite, I guess, the predecessors or the descendants of these people that were trained by the CIA. Is that what we're seeing from these
Hmm.
documents?
Absolutely. And, the Stefan Bandera is a national hero in Ukraine.
Why is
His
that?
birthday every year is a national holiday. And the guy was a
What is
Nazi
it?
war criminal.
Right. What is it that the Ukrainians? I mean, I can't imagine every Ukrainian is a Nazi. They're not revering Nazis, or in their mind, I would think the average
Mm,
Ukrainian doesn't think that they're revering Nazis, right?
right.
So what is it about Bandera that the average non-Nazi Ukrainian finds appealing? Why would they revere this guy? Do we know?
Yes, they look upon him as a freedom fighter. And Ukraine is in that position of being stuck between Western Europe and Russia. And you could really split Ukraine right down the middle. Western Ukraine has always been more favorable to Europe. They want to be part of Europe. They have more
Hmm.
European ways, which is why they ended up allying themselves with Germany in the Second World War. Eastern Ukraine, that's Soviet country. And to this day, they still look upon Joseph Stalin as a hero. They love the Soviet Union, and many of them want to see the Soviet Union restored.
Hmm.
These Ukrainian nationalists, the mindset was always that they didn't really have loyalty to either side. They were fighting for the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, and sometimes they'd work with the Soviets when it was beneficial to them. Sometimes they'd work with Nazi Germany when it was beneficial to them. And sometimes they'd work with MI6 in the United States.
No, it's all right though. It's okay. I mean, it is. Your camera is sometimes tech happens. Tech happens.
Hey,
Um,
it would happen
so
now.
right. Well, that's okay. It's okay. It
Sorry about
happens.
that.
So basically, when it comes to, so you've got these people in Ukraine now. A lot of them love Stepan Bandera. They revere him. They see him as a freedom fighter. Understand that. But what's really interesting is the lack of accountability that Ukraine has even had when it comes to World War II and their role in the Holocaust, right? Like one thing that when I'd been over to Germany, the Germans, the German people would actually kind of state that they had a little bit of angst even against Austria for not really owning up to their role. They always felt like Austria wasn't doing enough to own up to its Nazi past. So, but what's interesting is no one has ever talked about Ukraine and the past that Ukraine has. Can you explain to us a little bit of how Ukraine, I know that there was this, that there certainly were a lot of the Nazi Germans that were imported over into Ukraine, like you said, like the prisoners, or they were over there. But were the Ukrainian people also very much aligned like the Austrians were? Or is it that these are descendants coming from Nazi Germany and Austria that ended up in Ukraine, and that these people are actually descendants of Austrians and Germans? So do you know if the people in Ukraine, are the Nazis that are there, the people that have been, or we should say historically, the ones that were there, trained by the CIA? Just to clarify, were these imported in from Germany and Austria, or were they actual Ukrainians? Because you mentioned that they were prisoners, or that they were, because I've heard differing accounts that a lot of
Both.
okay, so some of them were
Yeah,
actually
both is the
imported.
correct answer. But the nationalists were definitely Ukrainian. They were of
Okay.
Ukrainian origin, Soviet origin, which makes them traitors to their country. And that's exactly why Stalin had his agents out there hunting them. And sometimes he was successful. Stepan Bandera, for example, was tracked by the KGB for years. And as a matter of fact, in these documents, it's revealed that Bandera was in the process of getting a visa to come to the United States. The CIA was going to bring him to the United States. The very next day, October 15th, I believe, 1959, Bandera was assassinated by a KGB assassin with cyanide before
Yeah.
he could come to the United States. However, his second in command, Bandera's second in command, was a man named Mykola Lebed, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And he was, in fact, recruited personally by Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, who
Wow.
brought him to the United States despite the fact that he had a murder conviction for war crimes, which should have prevented his entry into this country. And there's a letter in these documents, and I've posted it in my Twitter thread. You can look at it, where you can see Allen Dulles writing to the Bureau of Immigration and saying, look, I've got this guy in Ukraine who's vitally important to our interests. Can you look the other way and let him into the country? And they did. So Lebed came to New York City, and the CIA set him up with a publishing company, which was a CIA front, called Prologue Publishing. And his job was basically to publish pro-Ukrainian propaganda for the Ukrainian community in the United States. Anti-Soviet propaganda.
Yeah.
And this went on for years and years. I believe Lebed lived to a ripe old age, and was never held accountable for anything that he did during World War II.
Well,
He was protected.
A lot of this stuff right now, I understand that we're using these people still. We're using the descendants of this of just like we had the descendants of the Mujahideen that ultimately ended up rising up and fighting against the United States and Western interests, really against Western imperialism in their own area of the world. And now this time with these Ukrainian Nazis, ultimately these nationalists, they are unfortunately still on the U.S.'s side of this. Like, we're not, even though we've admitted over the years of having this problem in Ukraine, there have been numerous mainstream media reports talking over the past years of the Nazi problem in Ukraine. And then suddenly, of course, the war breaks out and there are no Nazis in Ukraine. Right. They're just not there
What
anymore.
Nazis?
Right. Yeah. Suddenly, even though mainstream media had admitted for many, many years that there was a Nazi problem. So really, unfortunate that we're still We're still arming them. We're still training them, bringing even some potentially over to the United States to train in Oklahoma to get ready for, to be able to use bigger, better weapons against Russia. And I think this is a warning, right? This is a warning when we look at what happened with the Mujahideen, that this could eventually backfire on us at some point, or at least backfire on the West. Poland very much could backfire against Poland, would be my guess, and that Poland might have a real problem with this in the future when they realize that a certain faction has been really amplified and supported, and it very much could backfire against them in particular.
That's very, very true. And that's my concern as well. And, it's important to point out when you go through these documents, and there are thousands and thousands of them, it'll take you a while, but it's an interesting read. You'll also find that many in the CIA, especially right after World War II, had serious reservations about working with the Ukrainian nationalists for these very reasons that you just speak of. There was a lot of disagreement within the agency, a lot of back and forth, but this is what Allen Dulles wanted.
Yeah.
And what Allen Dulles wants, Allen Dulles gets.
Well, that guy is a real character that we should be diving into at some point. He seems to have his hand in a lot of nefarious activities for the United States. So we will definitely talk more about him in the future. Lori, thank you so much for being here. Where can people find your work?
You can find me on YouTube at Lori Spencer, and I'm on Twitter at Real Lori Spencer, and you can read lots and lots of my research into the CIA's dirty deals, not just in Ukraine, but I'm also a specialist in the JFK assassination. And
which Dulles
you'll
has
find
some
lots of interesting information on Allen Dulles in that case as well.
Yeah. All right, Lori, thank you so much for being here.
It's great talking to you, Kim. Thanks for having me.